How can cities pay for the things they want to do, from a just transition to net zero to dealing with long-standing social problems? Welcome to this Festival of the Future City event. I'm Andrew Kelly. I'm joined today by Alice Charles, who leads the World Economic Forum's cities and real estate work streams, including the Global Future Council on Cities and Urbanisation, the Real Estate Industry Action Group, and the Future of Urban Development and Services Initiative. Greg Clark is Group Advisor, Future Cities and New Industries at HSBC Group, member of the World Economic Forum Future Council on Cities and Urbanisation, and the Cities Council of Bloomberg New Economy Forum. Greg is also chair of the Connected Places Catapult, the UK's innovation accelerator for cities, transport and place leadership, and chair of the United Kingdom Government Connected Places Advisory Group. Marvin Rees is Mayor of Bristol and currently working with the World Economic Forum and the Open Society Foundation, as well as cities around the world on, amongst other things, financing city programmes. Thank you all for joining us today. Marvin, as a city leader, tell us what you want to do and what kind of levels of investment you're looking for.
Well, our aim, in a nutshell, Andrew, has been to turn Bristol into a city of hope. It's a broad term, but it's actually quite profound. You know, hope is fundamental to life, and for me, it means making sure that whatever circumstances people are in today, they can face tomorrow, knowing that there's a collection of people, institutions, opportunities that create the possibility that tomorrow can be better than today. Then when that works itself out practically, it looks like good quality housing, access to education, decent work, the opportunity to live in a community in which people get to know their neighbours and build those human relationships, that we all need. And delivering all of that stuff that depends on life takes finance. We've done a lot of work in Bristol to organise us as a city so that we can become more than the sum of our parts, essentially. I'm the mayor of Bristol, but I don't control the National Health Service, I don't control our universities, our private sector, our voluntary sector. So we've done a lot of convening under this banner of the One City office and develop the One City approach. How can we get alignment from all of those organisations around a shared number of a smaller number of shared priorities? So we've done that internal work, and that's good. But the missing piece really is how we're going to pay for stuff. And sometimes the challenge is always, you politicians, you don't do this, you don't do that. It's not an absence of political will. It's an absence of the money to pay for retrofitting homes. It's an absence of money to go and buy land before it goes on the private market and actually to get it developed. It's where do you get the finance to build a mass transit system? And that's where we've come to at this moment in time, in the work with Alice, the work with Greg, is how we look at the existing financial world and the existing financial vehicles that are out there and say, how can you become more available to cities? And that's one of the gaps. It's, they work with national governments, but how can they work with cities? And where there are gaps, how can new financial vehicles, new financial opportunities be built that cities can begin to access directly, whether or not they're getting the direct or proactive support of their national governments?
Greg, can you set this in context for us in terms of how cities around the world operate?
I can, Andrew. Delighted to do so, and what a pleasure to be here with Marvin and with Alice. I think the simple thing to say is this, that as we approach what we might call the 5th decade of the century of the city, we're on our way at the end of this century to about 10 billion people living in about 10,000 cities. And the consequence of that is that we all understand that to decarbonize the planet, to produce jobs and fairness, to create environments in which people can live healthily, a massive investment is required in our cities, and some people estimate that to be something like $150 trillion. So it's a big amount of money. Now, the issue is that although we know cities are the key to good, healthy lifestyles and a decarbonized planet, actually every city is organized slightly differently. So to put it at its most simple, Andrew, there's a big group of cities around the world that are highly financially empowered. You could say that Hong Kong, Singapore, Berlin, Vienna, you would probably put Tokyo into this box as well. They have a big financial machinery within the city government framework that enables them to finance things as they need to by generating their own revenues and doing it that way. There's a second group of cities that are highly dependent upon transfer payments from national governments and other higher tier governments, and they benefit a lot from, as it were, the support of their national governments. Capital cities in ASEAN, you'd probably say many of the capital cities in Latin America are in this boat. And then there's a third group of cities where you have relatively weak local governments in the sense that they don't have strong financial powers, and you have a very active kind of corporate base across transportation, utilities, house building, obviously energy, water, waste, where, if you like, the local government doesn't have much hard power, but they have to use their soft power in just the way that Marvin was describing to convene and to organize the other players to get them to invest together. We know that all the benefits from decarbonizing investment comes from doing, for example, transport and land use together, or health and housing together, or water and energy together. These things work much better when they're combined and convened. So if we look very quickly at a couple of very big countries, think about China. One of the reasons they've been pretty successful in their mass urbanization approach is that they've combined all three elements of this. They've got quite empowered city governments, they've got strong transfer payments coming from higher tiers, but they've also got a whole group of state-owned enterprises who've been told that they have to really help the cities and make this work. And of course, although there are risks in this, and Alice may want to comment on some of those, the idea, for example, that you can use public land as an asset, essentially, to trade into the equation about infrastructure investments, very important. If we compare China with India for a minute, you might say that none of those three things apply except in certain locations. So local governments are not very empowered, they can't do it themselves. State governments tend not to favor cities because actually there's more votes in rural areas. And the big private sector players do engage in urban investment issues, but only on a relatively choosy basis. There's no sort of policy to make them do that. So the issue we have here then is this: there are different kinds of financial systems, different kinds of business models for cities. And if we're thinking about the UK, it's really about how to optimize the partnership with third parties, particularly those companies that Marvin mentioned, at the same time as petitioning effectively for more transfer payments where public financing is essential, and then at the same time to try to acquire more financial powers for cities over time.
We'll come back to some of those specific points in a short while. Alice, please do feel free to comment on anything Greg said, but you're also finalising a report, aren't you, for the World Economic Forum on financing cities? Perhaps you could also give us some headlines from that.
Yeah, first of all, thank you very much for having me, and it's an honour to be here with Mayor Rees and Greg. And just to set in context what we've been doing. So this is work that we've been doing through the World Economic Forum Global Future Council on Cities of Tomorrow, which both Greg and Mayor Rees are part of. And it's essentially a think tank that is focused on the future of cities. And I guess this council has been thinking about where we are in relation to our cities, that city leaders around the world are very much focused on how they can drive a green and just recovery in our cities. But this is set against the backdrop of COVID-19 and the impact that this has had on city government finances. So I guess it's the perfect storm, if you like, in that in terms of city budgets, what they've seen is revenue decreases, and that's been losses in terms of parking charges, toll charges, property taxes, sales taxes, etc. But at the same time, their costs have been accelerating in terms of sanitation and, in some cases where they have responsibility, health as well. And some who have large investment portfolios have seen decreases on their returns on investment. So that's kind of the backdrop in terms of city budgets. But at the same time, those that are reliant upon national government has a greater debt load than it's ever had before in terms of trying to pay for, the COVID-19 pandemic. So cities are again seeing reduced transfers coming from national government. So that's the sort of backdrop and where we started talking about, okay, what is the ability of a city to attract finance, to drive this green and just recovery that they so want within their cities. So the report that we're working on is currently in draft format. We're hoping to publish in December of this year. But very broadly, what it tries to do is, first of all, set the scene. So, try to provide some clarity on what are the barriers to actually obtaining finance within cities. So I guess it's trying to educate city leaders on the barriers that they see. For example, that includes a lack of capacity and expertise in cities to bring forward projects that generally Greg and his peers would call bankable projects. And what they mean by that is projects with the risk profile and the structure to attract investment. And often the finance world will say, we have lots of money, but we have a lack of bankable projects. So it's trying to advise city government on how you can structure these projects and have the risk profile to attract investment. But also, I guess the other thing this report is trying to set out is the opportunity to work with the private sector, and whether it's what Greg highlighted in terms of leveraging your soft powers, or whether it's actually borrowing from capital markets, there is a role to be played in terms of working with the private sector. It also highlights the issues that are preventing access to international finance. And I guess one of the other things that we have seen from the COVID-19 crisis is that many cities did not have an emergency budget. So, that has further constrained them in terms of being able to respond to the crisis. But what we have sought to highlight there in the report as well is understanding what financing sustainable and resilient infrastructure would look like in cities, the sources of urban finance, the market-based solutions, the policy tools that they can implement, what blended finance looks like, and indeed what is the role of philanthropy in terms of attracting finance. We've also looked at the overall impact of COVID-19 on city finance in terms of what I mentioned, city budgets, how the private sector finance landscape has changed, and indeed how the landscape has changed in terms of the multilateral development banks. What we have seen there is more of a switch in focus. So there is a big focus on financing the green transition. So what cities are trying to do and what multilateral development banks are trying to finance, and indeed the private sector is trying to finance, are very much on par. We also did a huge survey of cities around the world to try and understand how they are reflecting on their impact of COVID-19 on their budgets, but also how they're thinking about their future capital projects. And what we have seen is that many of them have in fact stalled their capital projects as a result of COVID-19. And I guess how we're trying to bring all of this together, and indeed this was a suggestion of Mayor Rees as a mayor trying to finance infrastructure projects within a city, is we've tried to set out what good looks like. So what a city needs to do in terms of trying to attract finance in the future. So that is what good looks like in terms of municipal borrowing and credit worthiness, what good looks like in terms of municipal company setup, for example, but also what good looks like in terms of the soft powers that a city can leverage to try and attract finance. And the final point is just to respond to what Greg was saying, just in relation to China. China is very much in the news right now. And I guess what we often would have heard in recent years is people compare India with China and say, well, how is it that the biggest democracy in the world hasn't been able to accelerate city investment in infrastructure and services, but China has been able to rapidly accelerate investment in cities and infrastructure over the last couple of decades. A lot of that has been fueled by national government selling off land. National and city government have owned a lot of land in China, so they've been able to sell land and leverage that for investment in infrastructure and services. However, there's risk associated because most of that land was being sold for the real estate market to develop residential development and indeed commercial development. We're now seeing how that is slowing down. And of course, that presents a risk in terms of trying to finance infrastructure and services in cities in China. And we may well see it slow down in that investment in infrastructure and services in China as a result. And as Greg rightly pointed out, the situation in India is somewhat different in that you have state government has a lot of the control. We have seen variations within states in India. And of course, states like Telangana, which has managed to develop Hyderabad very successfully, has invested very successfully in infrastructure in cities. But as Greg rightly pointed out, many of the state governments have been more concerned with meeting the needs of the rural voters, so they have been less concerned with cities, and that has resulted in less investment in city infrastructure.
Thank you, Alice. Let's stay on the subject of green transition for cities. I read one report, Greg, you gave this eye-wateringly large figure for the amount of money that cities need, and I read a report recently which said that just the core cities alone and the London councils need £200 billion to achieve net zero. Could you take us through, building on some things that Alice said there, some of the sources of finance that might be considered that could help make up that figure?
Certainly happy to do that, Andrew. And of course, the report you're referring to is the first report of the Cities Climate Investment Commission, in which Marvin and I are both board members. And actually, the whole initiative was inspired by Marvin's dialogue with the leader of the City of Glasgow, Councillor Susan Aitken. Basically, Marvin and Susan said in no uncertain terms, we have to create a coherent roadmap for financing decarbonisation of UK cities, despite the fact that we know that it's not going to be one big transfer payment from central government, because that's not the situation that we're in. So what that report does is essentially to look at 5 areas, looks at residential real estate, corporate real estate, it looks at the EV charging side of mobility as a service, it looks at energy provision, and it looks at waste and other utilities. And it asks the question, what's needed to decarbonise these activities across the UK's 12 largest cities, and what would it cost? And that's your 200 billion. Now, the presumption we're all making is that it's going to be a blended finance solution in each of these, but the blended finance will be a slightly different blend depending upon the activity. For example, in residential real estate, where you're talking about converting to zero carbon energy, improving energy efficiency and everything else, clearly owner-occupied homes are going to need to be financed in a different way from ones that are socially owned by registered social landlords or even public sector housing. So you're going to see a bit of a mix there. The same thing with EV charging. If we want to see EV charging ubiquitously rolled out, of course, there's going to be a contribution from the energy companies, but there'll also, I think, be a contribution from public transport authorities and other kinds of bodies. So the blended finance begins to come. Now, you ask the sharp end of the question, what are the sources of capital for this? Some of this will have to be government money. And, our cities do not have some of the basic things that they need to finance the infrastructure that's required to attract the private capital. If you like, you can get locked into a low public, low private finance equilibrium in which nothing happens. But if you can raise the level of public finance for some of these activities, you can then leverage much more private finance on the back of it. And this is, as I understand it, what Marvin and Susan were really talking about when they started to develop this. So the good news is this, that across the financial community, and this is articulated in the Glasgow Alliance for Net Zero, for example, GFANZ, Glasgow Financial Alliance for Net Zero, you see banks, pension funds, insurance companies, sovereign wealth funds in particular, all sorts of mortgage providing companies, as well as a very wide range of corporates that are in the space of mobility, utilities, infrastructure, real estate, all of which are interested to engage and finance these things. So if you like, there's a kind of jigsaw puzzle that we all have to complete, whether we're thinking about EV charging or we're thinking about circular waste or we're thinking about the move towards localized renewable energy, which combination of public finance and private finance will work in each domain? And that's not something where, if you like, the answer is a theoretical one. It's where you've actually got to put the entities around a table and say, if we finance this, can you finance that? That involves bringing together a series of different business models in interesting and new ways. And one other thing to say, Andrew, is that there's another bit of good news on the horizon, which is, of course, the UK has now established its own UK Infrastructure Investment Bank. In my opinion, we don't need that bank to provide lots of capital. Actually, the capital's there. It needs to do the things that will enable the capital that's there to get together with the assets that Marvin and Susan have been talking about. So I think that will be more about interest rate discounts, more about technical assistance to improve bankability and investability. It will be more about guarantee schemes. So if you like, we don't need that bank to provide the money. We need it to provide the platforms that make some of these pathways bankable for the long term. So it's obviously a very complex subject, but that's a quick answer.
Thank you very much. We will be posting links to various documents, including that report, in as part of the event, so people can read further on. Alice, I want to ask you a couple of questions before coming to Marvin. The first is about particular examples from that you've come across around the world of interesting work in this area. And the second is a point you made in your contribution, is about philanthropic contributions. You know, Bristol as a city, you know, used to have companies that help build hospitals and so on, and public buildings and parks and so on. Can you take us through those two areas for us?
Yeah, first of all, I just wanted to build a little bit on what Greg was saying before I turn to sort of examples. Just the net zero agenda is obviously the right agenda for cities to be focused on, and as we move towards COP26 in Glasgow in November, more and more cities around the world will be committing to be net zero. Many indeed are committing to be net zero by 2025, and the latest is 2050. So, and we must have a decade of action. We must significantly reduce our emissions in this decade. But I think there are some things that we need to bear in mind that also have positive consequences ultimately in terms of financing infrastructure and services in cities. So we cannot have a city that is net zero if it's a sprawling city. A city must be compact if it's going to be a net zero city. However, that also has positive implications in terms of financing. The economies of scale associated with financing infrastructure and services are much greater when you have a compact city than when you have a sprawling city. So just to say, you know, there's a role of urban planning as well in terms of ensuring you have a compact city, which makes infrastructure more viable, but also helps you with your net zero agenda. And also just to say, you know, the three big things you've got to focus on to get to net zero are decarbonizing your electricity grid infrastructure, and also decarbonizing your mobility infrastructure, and creating ultra efficient buildings. If I turn to buildings first, you know, in any city around the world, government tends to be the biggest real estate owner. And whether that's social housing, civic buildings, a variety of other buildings and land, government tends to own a lot of property. So there's a real role for government in terms of leading. And if we turn to social housing, for example, often social housing that we see, those buildings are buildings that have the lowest building energy rating. People are living in energy poverty. People are living in unhealthy buildings. So, you know, government really has a responsibility to try and ensure that they can retrofit those properties. And I think in that context, also, it can lead to a jobs-led recovery, in that a lot of jobs can be created by retrofitting buildings. So there's a real role and responsibility for government to think about, and when I say government, I mean all arms of government, multi-level government, to think about how they can work together to retrofit those assets. But also from a city government point of view, there's very much a role from the convening side for you know, assets, residential assets that are privately owned. So to think about how can you work with domestic finance institutions to try and get them to unlock finance to, to enable these owners of these properties to retrofit their housing stock. But in some cases, there's a bundling element that local government will have to bring to bear to try and scale some of these projects, to try and ensure that they are investable assets. But I guess the wider piece in terms of mobility and in relation to energy, this often requires city government to leverage its soft powers, because utilities are often owned by national government or private sector entities, and the same often applies to the mobility sector, where again it's often controlled by national government or private sector entities. So there's a greater role in terms of soft power that they have to play. So turning to examples, I think, I've often heard Greg actually use the example of Barcelona and Sao Paulo, and in fact, I don't want to steal your thunder, Greg, but I am going to mention it. And that is where they very effectively use land value capture to as a taxation mechanism to actually finance the delivery of infrastructure and services. I also want to highlight the example of Canada. And, when Greg was talking about the UK setting up its National Infrastructure Bank, it, triggered my thought in terms of what they did in Canada. And the Canada example is the Smart Cities Challenge. And when I say Smart Cities Challenge, you might think IoT solutions, but it wasn't that. What they focused on was getting all sort of local authorities from villages, towns, cities, to put forward their vision for the transition of their cities. And the transition of their cities is very much around, the green transition, but also the just transition, but also the digital transition. So thinking about how they could create local authorities, local environments that were fit for, current requirements and indeed future requirements. So that was an exercise where local government worked with citizen groups on the ground to create a vision. So they created a long-term strategy for all arms of city government. So that was led by the Ministry of Infrastructure and Communities in Canada. And they then worked with the Ministry of Finance to double the allocated infrastructure spend in Canada to enable the delivery of some of the more risky infrastructure projects. The third thing they did was set up an infrastructure bank. And as Greg referred to, that was often to provide these local authorities more with the capacity to enable them to leverage various blended sources of finance. So I think it's a really good example. Also, to mention Australia, Australia tends to be quite good at, finding ways and means, creative ways and means of investing in infrastructure assets. And one of the things that they have been doing is recycling infrastructure spend. So, for example, they have been offloading some of their infrastructure that the market could operate much more effectively and reinvesting that capital into more risky projects that government needed to take forward because the market wasn't willing to take forward. So they're just a couple of examples that I wanted to refer to today.
Thanks. We'll come back to philanthropy later on if we have some time. Marvin, you've been doing this work in preparation and build up to COP26. What do you hope will come out of this, and what are you looking to COP26 to help you deliver?
So I'm nervous of COP. What I hope will come out of it is not just a collection of statements, but commitments that are attached to real finance, dates, and measurable outcomes. I think if those three things are not there, it's incredibly challenging. As Alice said, we need to be this is a decade for action. It's a decade of delivery. We have to maximize the activity we do this in this decade because it will set our trajectory. And the longer we leave it, the harder it will be to rectify things later. The more punitive the interventions will have to be to keep our planet habitable as possible for human beings. So that's really what we're looking for. I think it's also important. We've talked, about finance, but we've referred to it in this conversation as well, that the finance is about the decarbonisation investments themselves, but it's also about the context in which it happens, what we've called referred to as the just transition. So front-loading investment in green infrastructure now, to me, off the back of COVID, made sense, right? We generate jobs and we decarbonise the economy, we decarbonise our economic recovery as the economy speeds up again. That just intuitively makes sense. But we also have to make sure that in the course of this transition to a decarbonised economy, the people who have benefited least from our economy are not asked to pay disproportionately the highest price. My concern is if we don't do that, we'll end up like the world did at the turn of the millennia, with people saying, well, I don't want globalization, it's not working for me, I'll burn down all the houses. And you end up with a reaction to the transition. So quality, we are talking about green finance, but around that, we have to be talking about how we provide good quality social care, how we fund our education system, how we meet our housing crises, which is about good quality zero carbon homes in the right places. All of these wider social issues have to be dealt with. Now, the challenge around that has just got a lot worse, a lot harder to take on, because by definition, COVID, we've seen it's hit the most marginalized, the most vulnerable first and hardest, and now they're going to be least well placed to benefit from any economic upturn when it comes. So the need for us to be incredibly proactive around delivering inclusive economic recovery is all the heightened. I'd also if I can just pick up on Alice's point about compact cities as well. I mean, Andrew, you're in Bristol, you've seen the debates in this city as well. I face as a mayor now. We're a city of 460,000 people. We're growing to 550,000 in the next 25, 30 years. We're 42 square miles. We're not getting any more of those square miles in our surface area. And we have approaching 16,000 on our housing waiting list, over 1,000 families, households in temporary accommodation. We have a housing crisis today. And again, it's the challenge of mayors to be able to deliver. What I'm getting increasingly is people saying, well, don't build there, but don't build up. So where are you left? What are your options? And my challenge has been, well, if you want to advocate not building homes, that's fine, but just be honest that that's what you're arguing and stand by the consequences of that. Make your argument. But it is going to be the challenge facing cities. How do we accommodate that growing population? But while it's a challenge, if I just something Greg said earlier on, badly designed cities or cities that are allowed to grow in an unplanned bad way will be a major problem. And we see that we'll be custodian, we'll be the holders of inefficient lifestyles that pump out CO2 emissions, will be cauldrons for social instability and conflict, driving migration around the world as people look for safety. We'll see that. But if we can get proactive around cities and think actually cities can offer efficient lives, and in many ways they become maybe arcs, as it were, for a growing global population, right? If we looked at the ability, the potential of the world's 10,000 cities to be the places where people live, the 10 billion people we're looking at living on the planet, and we had a proactive approach to that, I think we see a source of hope. And I'd love to see something coming out of COP, not 100% confident, but let's see, that actually begins to look at cities, not just as subsets of nations, but actually as an international network of assets that we could begin to invest in and proactively design to be able to cope with a growing global population. But it would take transcending national boundaries. It would be seeing those as international assets, not just as, like I said, subsets of nations, single national governments.
Thanks, Marvin. Just a couple of final points, starting with you, Greg. Cities need long-term financing and long-term support, and yet a lot of investors want a short-term return. How do we match this up in terms of dealing with some of these bigger social problems as well as the climate crisis?
Well, Andrew, I don't think it's always true that investors want short-term returns. Some different providers of capital maybe want that. Some people in the private equity markets perhaps are looking for turnaround situations where they can change the performance of something and then sell it. But often they're then selling it to a more patient investor, to a sovereign wealth fund or a pension fund or an insurance company or another. So I think that in terms of investors, some of them have appetite for risk. Some of them have appetite for long-term return and are patient. What you've got to do is get them working together in the right way. So classic example of this is that in the decarbonisation of urban districts, we often find that we'll get a private equity player that wants to, in a sense, buy as many properties as they can in a district, improve their environmental performance, improve their economic performance, and then sell it on to a pension fund or a superannuation scheme or something like that. So I think we need to use the right kinds of capital for the right kind of moments in the transition cycle. That's the first thing. And then secondly, to pick up really the points that Marvin was making very, very clearly, you know, capital increasingly wants to be recognized as responsible. The challenge for all capital providers is not just to make a profit, but to work within what we might call the agreed license to operate. And that license to operate is part of the overall social contract. So increasingly, if you're a financial institution and you're not doing the right things, both in terms of planet, but also in terms of fairness, you will find it hard to access capital on the capital markets. You'll find it hard to attract and retain staff. You'll find it hard at the annual shareholder meeting to justify what you're doing. And you'll find it hard to conform with increasingly progressive regulation around the world. So I think that the tide is turning in terms of what capital sees its role as being. And you only have to look at groups like the Glasgow, the Glasgow Financial Alliance for Net Zero to see the huge range of financial players who are now making a commitment to this. If you like, the financial industry is catching up with global realities and it's trying to align with it. The key challenge is the one that Marvin and Alice have really been talking about, which is how to put that together in new investment models. And that's what we're trying to do with the UK Cities Climate Investment Commission that Marvin and Susan inspired us to set up.
And Alice, what work needs to take place by cities to advocate to attract this kind of capital?
So I mentioned earlier that cities often lack the expertise to create projects that are bankable. I think, first of all, cities do need to either provide that expertise in-house, so get a staff who are familiar with accessing capital markets, or they have to obtain it from a multilateral development bank. So in the UK context, the National Infrastructure Bank will provide a lot of that capacity and support. So I think that's super important, having the expertise that knows how to create and structure projects that are bankable is very, very important. I think also the city needs to be able to leverage its soft power. So take this leading role in convening. So convening around, for example, the transition of building, convening around the transition of energy infrastructure, convening around the transition of mobility infrastructure. But also, cities need to look to other sources. And I didn't answer your question earlier in relation to philanthropy, but there is a real opportunity to leverage philanthropy. I suppose in the global context, some of the best known examples would be the likes of the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, which invests heavily in healthcare infrastructure, or the Hilton Foundation, which invests heavily in social housing and addressing the homeless crisis, or the Rockefeller Foundation, which has invested heavily in addressing resilience in cities around the world, which has more recently moved to the Atlantic Council. But in addition to many of these more global organizations, there's often local philanthropy that is an interest in investing in its city. And, I'm originally from Ireland, and I can think about a university in Limerick, which for years was supported by somebody from who was Irish American, who was a philanthropist, who was very focused in investing in a city that his family originally came from. So I think, there often are locals who wish to invest in the infrastructure and services in the city in which they come from. And I think the city needs to be prepared to unlock that as well.
And Marvin, how are you going to be able to unlock that? As I mentioned earlier, Bristol, you think of significant public buildings in the city and institutions that were built through private sector philanthropy or charitable philanthropy. What more can we do as a city to encourage that?
Well, we've been working incredibly hard with our private sector, in Bristol, and actually getting alignment with our voluntary community sector as well. So in putting together that one city plan we have in Bristol, which I'm sure you'll be able to put a link up to, the idea is that we say to the outside world, and the inside world actually, that as a city, we're grabbing our future by the scruff of the neck, and we're being intentional about what we want to be and how we want to get there. So I've said to companies that want to come to Bristol, if you come here, you will then be able to play an active part in the future iterations of our one city plan. All right. So you don't put your money here and then disappear. Come and actually then speak into the context in which your investment is going to live and help shape. Right. You maximize the possibility of your investment becoming everything that you want it to be. So we've been, I think one is that's proven attractive to businesses coming here, but it's also proven attractive to people like Lottery, for example, who comes actually, so I can, it's not just, you're not just after our money, you're after a relationship with us. And that's been, very good. We've also taken that to government. And again, in the name of, if you want to come somewhere where we are getting alignment, it's not easy, it's a complicated world, but we're getting as much alignment, as possible. Again, that's part of the message, that we take and that we think has been quite attractive. But also, Angie, one of the challenges that Greg and Alice have brought to cities that we've is one of scale. So it's about getting the projects to a bankable state. And again, that takes investment. And there's an internal conversation because, you have to pay people, and to bring a £4 billion mass transit system through as well. We're not going to get someone, for £17,000 a year. It costs money to get them. But scale has been a big challenge. And can single cities operate at the scale that is able to attract that level of inward investment? Well, the answer on that, and sometimes has been no. But what we have done through World Economic Forum and now working with Greg, is the core cities coming together as a collection of cities to begin to offer that scale. Outside of that, we've launched the Western Gateway, which is the economic footprint that stretches from Swindon to Swansea, Gloucester down to North Somerset, 4.4 billion people. So we're beginning to operate at a bigger scale on that front. But we've also been exploring how can we operate as international networks of cities and offer scale internationally. That would be a new way of working. But cities, there is the potential for cities to offer investment opportunities between them across those international boundaries as well. One thing's for sure, we can't keep doing what we've always done because it won't work. So we need finance to adapt, and we need cities to behave differently and to be given the space and the support to behave differently as well.
Well, I'm afraid we're out of time, but this is a subject we will return to. Thank you very much for joining us, Marvin, Alice, and Greg. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Pleasure.